I met Benjamin Torres Gotay in a park in San Juan recently. He's a columnist and editor for Puerto Rico's largest newspaper, El Nuevo Dia.
I had not been here since the hurricane. I find it very different. It had a lot of trees, a lot of palms.
The green has mostly come back to Puerto Rico, but the trees that lost branches look surreal, like green Q-tips with tufts of leaves coming out of the top. It's still unsettling.
As you can see now, it's almost naked.
A few weeks earlier, Gotay had written that Maria had ripped the skin off the island, revealing its skeleton and its flesh. We are left, he wrote, looking at ourselves in a warped mirror, confronted with the hardest realities of our collective life.
We've been living a long time under the assumption that we are rich or developed country. But the truth is that we have an enormous portion of our population living on poverty or near poverty. A lot of people living in rundown houses and houses not prepared to resist the force of a hurricane.
Before the storm, Puerto Rico's poverty rate was at nearly 45%. For context, Mississippi, the state with the highest poverty rate, is at 21%.
I use the image that it peeled the skin of Puerto Rico because I see it almost as a literal thing. You see a lot of communities that were covered by trees and vegetation. After the hurricane, they were revealed as what they really are.
One of the landscape's dominant features, aside from swaying palms and sparkling beaches, are shopping malls and big box stores. The island has the highest density of Walmarts and Walgreens in the world. Most towns have a public square, or plaza, but in San Juan, when people say they're going to plaza, they mean Plaza Las Americas, the mega mall that serves as the city's main meeting place, and generally that assumed that most people had the money to spend. Inequality wasn't front of mind. But that's changed. This week, a UN envoy on extreme poverty and human rights toured Puerto Rico on a fact-finding trip. A study from the University of Puerto Rico found that the storm likely pushed the poverty rate up to 52%. In the town of Utuado in the mountains, high school students were decorating the square ahead of a Christmas celebration. Walter Ronald Gonzalez was there too. He's the director of art, culture, and tourism for the region, one of the most rural, hardest-hit areas of Puerto Rico.
We have seen poverty that was covered up, because now there are some people who have said, I haven't had electricity in my home for these many years, or I don't have tap water and I have to use water from the river.
This story has long been overlooked by the local news shows because they prefer to focus on the coverage of sensational crimes rather than the steady state of deep poverty. But with so many trees gone, some facts are just too visible to be ignored.
For example, in the metropolitan area, there is a young guy who lives under a bridge. He has lived there for years, but now he can be seen. And over that bridge travel thousands of metro area residents. How is it possible that now, because a tree moved, they can see him for the first time?
Now, TV programs show critical aid getting to remote homes in the countryside. Homes many didn't realize were always so isolated.
Unfortunately, they waited until Maria to do it, but it should have been done before. And that's the reality that Puerto Ricans didn't want to accept or even see.
Puerto Ricans have also been confronted with their place in the Caribbean.
Puerto Ricans don't often imagine themselves as one of the little islands, even though we are, right?
Yarimar Bonilla is an anthropologist at Rutgers University, now working on a book about the crisis. She says that as bad as things got in Puerto Rico during its 10-year recession, the relationship with the U.S. always set the island apart from the rest of the Caribbean.
We always have thought of ourselves as better off than our Dominican neighbors and our Cuban neighbors. And so right now, Cuba, they were able to recover from Irma quickly. They got their power back and they're doing good. The Dominican Republic, they're sending us aid and everything we're eating is from over there.
Besides, the U.S. sent more American troops and helicopters to Haiti in the days after the 2010 earthquake than we sent to Puerto Rico.
So it's really forcing Puerto Ricans to come to terms with that reality. I don't know where that will lead politically.
All discussions inevitably lead to the issue of the island's political status. And here we are. But first, an observation. In my first week in Puerto Rico, 50 days after the storm hit, I began to notice a pattern. Even after telling me that washing laundry by hand made their skin raw, or that reading by candlelight was straining their eyes, people would also tell me they had gotten used to a new normal. They had grown accustomed. acostumbrados.
Eso es cuestión de acostumbrarse.
Ya estoy acostumbrado.
Hemos tenido que acostumbrarnos y seguir
No two
luchando.
disasters are alike, but would Floridians or Texans just get used to not having electricity for 2 months, now going on 3? Puerto Ricans have settled into a kind of extended coping limbo. Community groups were activated to help, but restoring the full electric grid could take months. Again, Yarimar Bonilla of Rutgers.
So like when I ask people like, why don't you protest, or how does this make you feel about the government? Like one guy said, ¿qué voy a hacer? No me voy a pegar un tiro. You know? Well, what am I going to do? I'm not going to shoot myself in the head. It's a phrase that people use here. I think it speaks to the lack of options that people imagine. So it's either I accept it, or I leave, or I take my own life.
So, a lack of perceived options. And yet, one of the words you hear a lot in Puerto Rico is resilience.
Resilience is a human capacity to deal with tenacity when confronted with traumatic and difficult situations.
Alfredo Carrasquillo is a psychoanalyst and an expert on leadership at the University of the Sacred Heart in San Juan.
But resilience is not resignation. Resilience implies being stronger to handle things, and when things are not fair and not just, you confront them. So I'm not that sure if what we are seeing in many people in Puerto Rico is resilience or resignation. Resilience has political potential. Resignation has no political potential.
I first met Carrasquillo in June while reporting a piece for On the Media about the use of the word colony to describe Puerto Rico's relationship to the mainland. For decades, Puerto Ricans used euphemisms like Commonwealth or Associated Free State, but many had begun to use a label they felt was more honest, albeit painful. Carrasquillo uses colony, and he says it's essential to understanding why Puerto Ricans don't protest more.
It doesn't surprise me. What surprises me is our inability as a people to respond with anger to indignity. That resignation is impressive.
I will say that people are afraid, more than resign, are afraid.
Sandra Rodriguez Cotto, host of that nightly call-in show on Wapa Radio, hears constantly from callers about how hard it is just to get by and how they fear losing what little they have.
If you ask people, people don't want to be separated from the United States. We feel American, even though we might think we're Puerto Rican culturally. That's a dichotomy, that's a contradiction that we have. And I think it's because of so many years of being a colony.
There's a history of protesters being persecuted on the island, especially those in the independence movement. Entire families were blacklisted by the government. In the 50s, a gag law banned public speech about independence and even outlawed displaying the Puerto Rican flag. Now, says Cotto, Maria has exposed the island's real status as a U.S. colony. No more euphemisms. Americans, some of them anyway, are finally paying attention.
I think the American public, for the first time ever, is seeing Puerto Rico for what it is. I mean, we're being on the forefront of the news. So now people are saying, wow, we have some people dying, and we're doing in Puerto Rico what we have been criticizing in other places. They might feel a little bit embarrassed for what they're seeing in Puerto Rico.
The columnist Benjamin Torres Cotay thinks that if this were anywhere else, there would be major protests in the streets, people demanding more government help and a faster recovery. But after more than 100 years of U.S. colonial rule, Puerto Ricans are used to waiting and fending for themselves.
People here protest by immigrating. So that is a fact of life in Puerto Rico. That is a characteristic of the people of Puerto Rico, basically. Resignation, yeah. People here are not used to stand up to power.
I asked him, how do you solve that?
Well, I don't have an answer. Colonialism is a two-way problem, and the colonial power is the United States. They have to speak clearly, and they have not done that in over 100 years.